welcome to SpyHards podcast, the weekly podcast where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the knock list. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam, the provocateur.
Now, usually we would talk about what film we're doing this week, but you've tuned in to the briefing. This is the episode where we lay the groundwork and tell you what this podcast is about, which leads me to my first point. Cam, what is this podcast about?
Well, you know, Scott, and over the many years we've known each other, I guess, what, eight years now? Is that about right?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay, yeah. We've talked a lot about James Bond because you being British, I just assumed that you just celebrate James Bond daily. And that's always been the case. That has never changed. I've always believed this.
I was born into a tuxedo drinking a martini. That is true.
Well, you are drinking a martini in the logo, so there you have it.
Well...
But yeah, I just always assumed, that James Bond held a certain role in your culture over there on the other side of the pond. And so I would always bring up James Bond stuff. And then, you started doing rewatches and we would talk a lot about James Bond, the tropes of the genre, the villains, characters, the stuff that was really weird and wild in those movies. And it sort of just organically led to the concept of this podcast.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in reality, I didn't have that much of a connection to Bond growing up. It was something that was definitely in the background, but until GoldenEye came out, actually, is the first film that really got me into the genre, which I actually played on the N64, the video game, before I even saw the film. That was really my first introduction to spies and the spy genre as a whole. But it was only until last year where I actually bought the whole Bond box set and went back and rewatched them all properly from the start, because I probably had seen them in some way, shape, or form growing up. I really, really doubled down on my love for Bond, and that was where it got started, really.
Right. I think a lot of people, maybe the majority of people, especially born past a certain period, were introduced to spy movies through James Bond. I mean, I guess there's maybe younger kids now who saw like Cars 2 or something, but by and large, I think James Bond plays a very significant role. For me, yeah, I mean, it was View to a Kill. Actually, my parents got it for us on the Canadian version of HBO, which is Super Channel. We had a free trial week. And one night, my sister had a soccer game that day. I'm probably like 10. My sister's about 8, I think. And my parents said, okay, kids, tonight we're going to order in pizza and watch a James Bond movie, which I actually kind of knew what James Bond was because I remember Archie Comics did a parody called James Denob. And so the name actually had stuck in my head. So I'd always say, oh, James Denob, of course.
That name does not work so well over here, unfortunately. If you call someone a knob, it's not going to go down too well. So.
No. Well, very American Archie, as American as apple pie. But so my parents showed us View to a Kill, which is an interesting one to introduce us to the franchise with. But, I was in love instantly and ultimately went down a deep dive of Roger Moore stuff. And from that point forward, just spies became really cool. And I think that's something that is going to be important to this podcast. And maybe what has sort of inspired it in some ways is that spy movies really personify cool. And they do it better than just about any genre.
Yeah, I think it's, unlike some other genres, like comedies or romance films, there's a certain amount of intrigue and enjoyment you can actually get from watching these films. And they feel cool. I think that is one of the premium words here is cool. You feel like you're living your life through Bond or Jason Bourne or anything like that. And I think that's what attracted me as a younger James Bond fan. I can't remember what year that was when GoldenEye came out, 95?
Yep.
And that was it from there on, really. And I think the other thing is with spy films is ultimately it's a bit of an escape.
Oh, totally. Yeah, definitely. James Bond definitely paved the way for that. Although we may feel differently when we're doing things like, say, like The Spy Who Came In From the Cold or something, some of the more serious ones. But by and large, yeah, spies definitely have that escapism. The heroes tend to be very slick and, calm under pressure and cool and collected. And, most of us aren't that in real life.
I don't know what you're talking about. I am British. This is literally how I roll.
That's true. I have no argument against that.
I mean, no word of a lie. There is a martini set in my drinks cabinet in the other room. Yes, I have a drink cabinet, people. And a shaking stir thing. I've got it all. I could make you a mean martini if you'd like.
Yes, me being Canadian, we don't have a lot of cool things to attach to us other than, I don't know, I guess some Canadians are super into hockey and poutine and stuff like that, but that doesn't really fit me. That's why I'm talking about spies.
Hey, I love your maple syrup. Don't knock it.
Actually, you know what? I do like maple syrup, so we got that. But we should talk a bit about some of the movies we're going to do, because I think there may be an automatic assumption, obviously James Bond, then that is definitely going to be a factor. But I think what we want to do is also have a wider purview and really look at all the highs and the lows of spy cinema over the many, many decades.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I find quite important about this podcast is expanding everyone else's horizons to what the genre can be. Because a lot of people might have seen GoldenEye, as we referenced earlier. I mean, have you seen From Russia with Love, if we're talking James Bond, or if we're moving away from Bond, everything from like North by Northwest to Austin Powers, comedies type spy films. There's a lot within this genre to dig into. And that's what attracted me to it in the first place, really.
And there's going to be some really, serious dramas we're going to tackle too that I think are great movies that maybe people haven't checked out. Stuff like Parallax View or 3 Days of the Condor, The Conversation. There's a lot of great movies out there in the spy genre, and it really does go right across the board. James Bond is totally like escape cinema versus some of the harder hitting stuff that really was commenting, and say, on 70s politics or what have you, or even things like I referenced it earlier, Cars 2.
Don't forget the Spy Kids films. We have 4 of those to tackle, and I frankly can't wait.
Yeah, right. Spy Kids, Spies in Disguise, the movie with the pigeons. There's all sorts of spy stuff. Maybe even the Dave Bautista movie, My Spy. Who knows?
We have plenty of time on our hands as we're all still locked inside, I think, a little bit. We're still in that era.
Well, and I think ultimately what is going to happen is with each movie we tackle, we're going to decide whether it makes the knock list. Now, you may have heard of the knock list, I think primarily from the 1996 Mission Impossible film. But to us, the knock list is the need to know official classics of the SpyHards podcast. And so you can track that every week at letterboxd.com/SpyHards. And we are going to, at the end of every episode we talk about a movie, induct or kick out a movie from the knock list. So say we're tackling My Spy, because of course we'll be doing My Spy, at the end, and we're going to debate, Scott, does My Spy belong in the knock list? Do people need to see this movie as part of the official, complete spy canon of films, like the great ones?
And there'll be some films that make the list that might not necessarily be the greatest films of all time. Mm-hmm. We might agree that whilst, I can't think of a great film off the top of my head. We'll go maybe North by Northwest is held as a great film. It might not be a great spy film against what we're looking for, and it might not meet our criteria. And in terms of the criteria, I think that's going to be quite loose. And a lot of it is going to be from how we feel about the films, which I think is a good thing. Ultimately, we're the arbiters of what goes on the list. Now, of course, we would like to hear back from everyone listening and watching at home. And if you have opinions about what goes on the list, we'd love to debate that with you. But ultimately, we make the final call because it's your ears that we're in.
That's right. And when all this is said and done and the knock list is assembled, this is not a subjective list. This is an objective list. There is no arguments against the knock list once it exists.
Even we can't go back and redact things, I think.
That's right.
I think once it's submitted, I think that's it now. It's basically committed for life.
And I think one of the struggles I'm going to have is, talking about James Bond or even the Mission Impossible franchise. There's going to be a tendency to say, well, it's part of the Bond franchise. It belongs in the knock list. And so we're going to have to really have hard conversations, Does, Goldfinger belong in there, but maybe not Diamonds Are Forever? Like, I don't know. That conversation will come later, but that's going to be really, really interesting when it comes to franchises where you would generally say, well, of course, they all go together because that's one big collection of movies.
Right. And I think it's going to be a bit of a discovery for us as we go through our first few episodes to try and figure out how we really define if it's on the list or not. But, stick with us, and I think we'll get there, and it will be more of a, I don't want to say formulaic way of doing it, but you'll understand our reasoning after a little while. We both come at from completely different sides of things. I mean, I know, Cam, you are a bit more of a cinema buff than I am. Would you say that's fair?
That's fair to say, yeah. I guess I've been writing film reviews for a long time. as well as I host the Arnie Geddon podcast, the Arnold Schwarzenegger podcast. Yeah, I guess so. But I think it's gonna be really interesting to see how our two, different sides kind of clash in the center. Basically, every knock list will be a cold war of you and I icily trying to induct a movie or shoot a movie down.
It's basically every episode will end in 30 minutes of me and you shouting at each other. Is that what we're saying?
Pretty much.
Hey, that's great.
And then ultimately just walking in separate directions and throwing up our hands.
Yeah, I mean, we've done that since we've known each other.
Pretty much.
Okay, Cam. So before we get talking about what we're going to be doing next week or first, I'd like to plug our social media. So you can find us at Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at SpyHards. So we're not hard to find. So make sure you follow us on there. We will be putting up information about upcoming movies there every week, our links to our reviews, and so forth. Cam, what are we doing next week?
We are going to take on 1995's GoldenEye, Pierce Brosnan's first movie in the role of James Bond, directed by Martin Campbell, who would one day go on to really be considered one of the great Bond directors with Casino Royale. And so this is a movie that I think holds a very important place in both our hearts, and I'm looking forward to determining whether it belongs on the knock list.
Me too. I'll be interested to see where it stands now, looking back on it after, 25 years?
Yeah, we're actually, I guess, on an anniversary.
Well, there we go. So, guys, make sure you subscribe so you can get our episode when it drops next week. We're aiming to be coming out weekly. But until then, good luck among the shadows.